The dim light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper of the small, suffocating room. Calla Reeves sat stiffly on the worn-out couch, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She could hear the rhythmic tapping of her uncle's fingers against the wooden table, a slow and deliberate beat that filled the silence between them. "You don't have a choice, girl," her uncle, Ralph Reeves, said, his voice slurred with the remnants of cheap whiskey. "This is happening." Calla swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. She had known for a long time that her uncle was no savior, but selling her? That was a cruelty she hadn't prepared for. "I'm not cattle," she bit out, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Ralph let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You think you have a say in this?" He leaned forward, his yellowed teeth bared in a smirk. "You've been living under my roof, eating my food. You owe me." Calla felt the sting of those words, even though she knew there was no real debt, just an excuse for control. She had spent years under his roof, enduring his temper, his neglect, his greed. She had wanted to leave for as long as she could remember, but options were scarce when the world saw you as nothing. Now, he was handing her off like a business transaction, a contract marriage. She had overheard pieces of the conversation before Ralph had summoned her. A deal with Lachlan Darcy, a man whose name sent ripples of unease through business circles. A billionaire, a ghost in the public eye, a man whose power extended far beyond what people dared to acknowledge. "I'd rather die," she spat, glaring at her uncle. Ralph's expression hardened. "That's not an option." He reached for a folder on the table, tossing it in front of her. The papers inside were crisp and official, the inked signatures proof that the decision had already been made. Her name was already there. Signed. Final. Calla's heart pounded. "You can either walk through that door tomorrow with your head held high," Ralph said, his tone almost mocking, "or they'll drag you there. Either way, you're marrying him." A thick silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Calla felt her breath catch, her chest tightening as reality closed in. She had no family, no money, and no way out. If she ran, where would she go? Who would help her? Her jaw clenched. "Why does he need a wife?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ralph shrugged. "Men like him don't explain themselves. All I know is, he paid well enough to settle my debts." His lips twisted into a grin. "And you? Well, you get to live in luxury. Could be worse. Could it?" Calla's stomach twisted. She had nothing. No safety net. No freedom. But marrying a man like Lachlan Darcy, a man who had to buy a wife, seemed like walking into another kind of prison. She pushed to her feet, knocking the papers to the floor. "I'll find a way out of this," she muttered. Ralph scoffed. "Go ahead and try, girl." As Calla stormed out of the room, she knew the odds were against her, but she had spent her whole life fighting, and she wasn't about to stop now, even if it meant standing against Lachlan Darcy himself. The wedding was as cold and impersonal as the contract that bound them. There were no flowers, no guests, no vows spoken with affection. The ceremony took place in a private study within Lachlan Darcy's estate, where the officiant, a man who barely looked up from the legal documents, read the necessary lines in a monotone voice. Calla sat beside Lachlan at a grand mahogany table, her fingers gripping the edge of the armrest. The weight of the moment settled over her, suffocating. She stole a glance at the man who was now, on paper, her husband, Lachlan Darcy. He was composed, indifferent, sharp features, neatly tailored suit, an air of untouchable authority that filled the room. She had expected a brute, someone cruel and forceful, but what she found was worse, an enigma. If he felt anything about this arrangement, he didn't show it. "Sign," he instructed, sliding the last document in front of her. His voice was low and even, like he was accustomed to issuing commands without question. Calla's stomach twisted. This was the final step, the last choice she had before this became real. She picked up the pen, hesitating. "This is nothing to you, is it?" Lachlan's gaze finally lifted to hers. His eyes, a striking shade of stormy gray, were unreadable. "I don't need a wife, Calla." His tone was measured, devoid of warmth. Just a name on a document. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Somehow, she had expected anger or possession, but instead, she felt something almost worse, detachment. Who was this man? She signed her name. The officiant took the papers without ceremony, nodding as he gathered them. Legally binding. Congratulations. It was done. A hollow silence followed, stretching between them like an abyss. Calla shifted in her seat, waiting for some kind of reaction from Lachlan. A word, a glance, anything that would reveal what she had just become a part of. But he simply stood, adjusting his cuffs like the evening had been nothing more than a business transaction. Your room has been prepared, he said. You'll be taken there now. Calla blinked. That's it. Lachlan tilted his head slightly, studying her. What were you expecting? A million thoughts flooded her mind, but she bit them back. A cruel smirk? A triumphant remark? Some acknowledgement that she was now his? Instead, she was faced with a man who didn't seem to care at all. He walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, I don't expect anything from you, Calla. Don't expect anything from me. Then he was gone. She exhaled, trying to process the strange hollowness in her chest. She had been sold into this marriage, but the man who had bought her barely seemed to notice she was there. Which begged the question, if he didn't want a wife, why had he needed one so badly? The mansion was beautiful, but it didn't feel like a home. Calla stood in the vast entry hall, the marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the chandeliers casting a golden glow that did nothing to warm the air. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that settled in places where people didn't laugh or live, only exist. A staff member, a tall woman with a professional smile, guided her toward the grand staircase. Your room is ready, Mrs. Darcy. The title made her stomach churn. She followed in silence, her steps light as they ascended the stairs. The mansion was a labyrinth of corridors, doors stretching endlessly in both directions. Calla had never seen so much space in her life, and yet, she had never felt more trapped. Her suite was luxurious, larger than any apartment she had ever lived in, but the grandeur only suffocated her further. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the estate's private gardens, and the bed, far too large for someone who had spent her life sleeping in cramped spaces, looked untouched, like no one had ever rested there. Lachlan wasn't waiting for her. Of course he wasn't. He had signed the papers, walked away, and that had been the end of it. Calla stepped forward, brushing her fingers against the velvet drapes, testing the weight of them. Everything here was heavy, from the furniture to the air itself, as if the walls held secrets they refused to give up. She turned at the sound of a knock. The door opened, revealing a man she hadn't met before, Rowan Sinclair. He was lean, sharply dressed, with a smirk that suggested he was always in on a private joke. He leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed. You must be the new bride. His tone was amused. Congratulations. Or condolences. Calla studied him warily. And you are? Rowan Sinclair. He pushed off the doorframe, stepping inside without invitation. I manage Lachlan's affairs when he's too busy pretending to have none. She narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? Rowan chuckled, glancing around her room as if he had seen it 100 times before. It means, sweetheart, that you should stop trying to figure him out. You won't like what you find. Something in his voice made her pause. Before she could ask anything else, Rowan nodded toward the hallway. Stay out of trouble, Mrs. Darcy. His smirk faded just slightly as he added, and whatever you do, don't go near the locked room at the end of the west wing. The warning sent a shiver down her spine. What was Lachlan hiding? The morning after the wedding, Calla woke to the unfamiliar hush of the mansion. No shouting, no threats, just silence. It felt wrong. She dressed quickly, refusing the carefully selected outfits laid out for her by the staff. She wasn't about to be someone's doll, paraded around to fit an image she had never agreed to. Instead, she slipped into a pair of simple black slacks and a fitted blouse. Her small rebellion against the cage Lachlan had locked her in. When she stepped out of her suite, a guard stationed outside barely spared her a glance. Mrs. Darcy, he acknowledged. She ignored him, moving through the corridors. If she was going to be trapped here, she would at least understand what kind of prison she was in. She didn't make it far. Lachlan was waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase, arms crossed over his chest. He looked effortless, composed, too put together for a man who had supposedly just gained a wife. Calla met his gaze and didn't slow her steps. You had guards outside my door. Lachlan tilted his head. That surprises you? It insults me, she shot back. He let out a slow exhale, as if she were an inconvenience he had no patience for. You have full reign of the mansion, as long as you stay within the boundaries I set. Boundaries, she repeated, stopping on the last step. You mean rules? Lachlan's mouth quirked, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Rules keep people alive, Calla. She didn't know why, but his words sent a ripple of unease down her spine. Before she could push further, Rowan appeared at the entrance, dressed in an expensive suit, his expression amused. We're late, he informed Lachlan, before turning his grin toward Calla. And you, darling, need to get changed. Calla frowned. Changed? Lachlan's gaze flicked down at her outfit, disapproval barely concealed. There's a charity event tonight. We'll be attending. I wasn't aware I had a schedule, she said, crossing her arms. Lachlan's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. You do now. The event was an illusion of elegance, full of sharp smiles and murmured gossip. Calla moved through the crowd with Lachlan at her side, the weight of eyes tracking their every move. People whispered about the mysterious new bride, about Lachlan's sudden marriage, about what it all meant. She was supposed to play the role, but the air felt suffocating. Every moment was orchestrated, every interaction rehearsed. And yet, Lachlan seemed utterly unfazed, until one particular conversation caught her attention. A man, Victor Caldwell, approached them with a practiced smile, his voice smooth as silk. Lachlan, we were beginning to think you'd never settle down, Victor mused. His eyes flicked to Calla. And so suddenly, too. Lachlan didn't react, but Calla felt the shift in the air. Tension. A silent battle neither man was willing to acknowledge outright. Calla tilted her head. You say that like he's incapable of commitment. Victor smiled. Oh, we all know Lachlan isn't the type for sentimental ties. Calla matched his smile, feigning naivety. Then I must be very persuasive. Lachlan let out a small, barely there chuckle, his gaze flicking toward her with something close to amusement. Victor's expression stiffened, just slightly. Hooking her arm through Lachlan's, she added smoothly, but then again, a man like my husband doesn't do anything he doesn't want to. Lachlan's fingers curled slightly against hers, a silent acknowledgement. For the first time that night, she felt like she had won something. But the way Victor watched them, his eyes full of calculation, made her stomach twist. Lachlan had enemies, and they were watching. The attack came without warning. Calla had been in the library, running her fingers over the spines of books she had no intention of reading, when she heard it, a noise just outside the doorway. A shift in the air, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. She turned just as two men stepped inside. They weren't staff. She knew that instantly. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive suit that barely masked the sharpness in his eyes. The second, leaner, with a casual ease that made him seem even more dangerous. Calla's heart slammed against her ribs. Neither of them spoke. They were waiting for her to panic. She refused. I don't believe we've met, she said, keeping her voice calm. The taller man smirked. No, we haven't. But we're here with a message. He took a step forward, and Calla moved before she could think, dashing for the door. A hand snatched her wrist, yanking her back so hard she stumbled, crashing against the bookshelf. Pain jolted through her side, but she barely had time to react before a hand clamped over her mouth. Not so fast. Her pulse roared in her ears as she fought, kicking, twisting, trying to break free. But he was too strong, his grip like steel as he pinned her in place. Listen carefully. The man growled near her ear. Your husband has enemies, sweetheart, powerful ones. And you're the weak link. The second man crouched in front of her, tilting his head. You're going to deliver a message for us. Tell Lachlan to step down. Walk away. Calla's breathing turned ragged, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. Or what? The man smiled. Or next time, we won't be so polite. The door slammed open before she could respond. Lachlan. His presence shifted the air in the room, cold and electric, like a storm right before it hit. The man holding Calla barely had time to react before Lachlan moved, swift and merciless. A single blow sent the first man crashing into the bookshelf, books tumbling around him. The second barely had time to reach for a weapon before Lachlan struck again, sharp, calculated movements that left both men gasping for air on the floor. Silence fell. Calla pressed against the bookshelf, heart hammering. Lachlan straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his suit, as if he hadn't just taken down two men without breaking a sweat. His gray eyes burned when they met hers. "You have no idea what you've been thrown into," he said, his voice quiet, lethal. Calla exhaled shakily, still feeling the phantom grip of her attacker's hands on her skin. Lachlan stepped closer, scanning her for injuries, his movements sharp but controlled. For the first time since they met, his detachment cracked, just slightly. His fingers ghosted over a bruise forming on her wrist, and something dark flickered in his expression. "This won't happen again," he murmured. There was a promise in his voice. And for the first time, Calla believed him. But she also realized something else. Lachlan wasn't just protecting her because she was his wife. There was more to this, and she needed to find out what. The weight of the attack still clung to Calla's skin like a bruise that refused to fade. She needed to get out. The mansion, cold and vast, felt smaller with each passing second, its walls pressing in on her like an invisible force. Lachlan might have saved her, but he had also trapped her. Whatever game he was playing, she refused to be his pawn. So she planned. She had spent the day watching the security rotation, noting gaps in their patrols. The front gates were impossible, but the back gardens stretched into a dense forest, one she could disappear into if she moved fast enough. It had to work. Calla dressed in dark clothes, slipping on sneakers instead of the heels they had provided for her. Her pulse pounded as she cracked the door open, peering down the empty hallway. She stepped out, keeping to the shadows. She reached the back terrace, the cool night air biting at her skin. Just a few more steps and she would be free. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere?" Her breath caught. Lachlan. He stood by the terrace doors, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. The faint glow of the garden lights cast long shadows across his sharp features, but his eyes, dark, knowing, never left hers. Calla's fingers twitched at her sides. "Move." He didn't. She took a step back, but he moved faster, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. She lashed out, trying to push past him, but he caught her wrist. Not hard, not painful, just firm enough to hold her in place. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "Do you really think they won't come for you?" She yanked at her arm, but his grip didn't budge. "I'll take my chances." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "There are no chances, Calla." His tone sent a shiver down her spine. "The men who broke into this house," he continued, "they weren't just here for a warning. They were testing my reach, my control." His grip loosened slightly, but his voice was sharper than steel. "Do you know what happens if they find you alone?" Calla swallowed, but she refused to show fear. "You don't own me." Lachlan exhaled, his fingers dragging down her wrist before finally letting go. He didn't move away, though. He stayed close, towering, unyielding. "I never said I did." His voice lowered, but there was something dangerous laced beneath it. "But I am the only thing keeping you alive." The words stung, because deep down, she knew they were true. She had thought Lachlan was the enemy, but now? She wasn't so sure anymore. The real enemy was out there, waiting for her to make a mistake, and she had almost handed herself to them. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. Lachlan must have seen the shift in her expression, because his stance relaxed, just slightly. "I can't let you go," he murmured. "Not yet." Calla clenched her fists, her escape plan now nothing but ashes. For the first time since she stepped into this house, she truly understood. She wasn't just a prisoner of circumstance. She was a target, and Lachlan Darcy was the only shield she had. The next morning, Calla awoke to a different kind of prison. Security had doubled overnight. Guards patrolled the hallways, stationed at every entrance like she was a high-value asset instead of a wife forced into marriage. Her frustration boiled over before she even left her room. She yanked open the door, only to find a broad-shouldered guard standing outside. His blank expression didn't change when she crossed her arms. "Move." "No can do, Mrs. Darcy," he replied, impassive. "Mr. Darcy's orders." "Of course." Calla slammed the door shut, biting back a curse. Lachlan. She was already suffocating under his control, and now this? She wasn't going to wait around and accept it. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, Another silent rebellion against the expensive dresses she refused to wear. She stormed through the mansion. She found Lachlan in his office, standing behind a sleek desk, flipping through documents as if the world outside his fortress wasn't closing in on her like a noose. "You doubled the security," she accused, stopping just short of his desk. He barely glanced at her. "Good morning to you too." "Don't do that," she snapped. "Don't pretend this is normal. I can't even step into the hallway without feeling like a hostage." His gray eyes lifted to hers, unreadable, calculating. "I told you, Calla. They won't stop coming for you. And what? You think trapping me inside is the solution?"
Yes.
His bluntness knocked the breath from her lungs. He sighed, setting his papers down before leaning back against the edge of the desk, regarding her carefully. "You don't understand what these people are capable of." She shook her head. "No, I don't, because no one tells me anything." For the first time, something in his expression flickered, something close to hesitation. A long silence stretched between them. Then, as if deciding something, Lachlan rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. The movement was casual, almost careless, until she saw them. The scars. Thin, pale lines slashed across the skin of his forearms, some deeper than others. Old wounds that had healed, but never disappeared. Calla stared, unable to mask the sudden hitch in her breath. Lachlan followed her gaze, but didn't move to hide them. Instead, he turned his wrist slightly, exposing one particular scar that stood out from the rest, a deep, jagged mark running from the base of his palm up toward his elbow. Her stomach twisted. "How?" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. It wasn't her place to ask, but Lachlan answered anyway.
A reminder.
His voice was low, edged with something she couldn't quite place. Of what happens when you trust the wrong people. For a moment, the office felt too small, too quiet. Calla shouldn't have cared, but she did. The air shifted between them, not quite soft, not quite sharp, but charged with something neither of them were ready to name. She didn't reach for him, didn't offer sympathy. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. "You think locking me away will stop them?" Lachlan studied her for a long beat. No, his voice was softer now, almost reluctant. "But it might give me enough time to stop them first." Her breath caught. This wasn't just about power or control. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. But as she turned to leave, she felt his eyes on her, watching, waiting. And for the first time since she arrived, she didn't hate the feeling. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excess, with glittering chandeliers, walls adorned with gold trim, and a sea of guests dressed in wealth. Everything about the charity gala screamed opulence, but to Calla, it felt more like a theater, a place where people performed, masks carefully in place. And tonight, she had to play her role. She adjusted the sleek black gown Lachlan had arranged for her to wear, its smooth fabric clinging to her in all the right places. The weight of a diamond necklace sat cold against her skin, a physical reminder of the position she had been forced into. Beside her, Lachlan was a vision of controlled power, a crisp black suit tailored to perfection, his presence commanding the room without a single word. "You'll stay by my side," he murmured, his voice low and firm as they stepped further into the crowd. "Smile when necessary. Speak only when spoken to." Calla arched a brow. "What if someone asks me an actual question?" Lachlan's lips twitched, but his expression remained unreadable. "Then make sure your answer serves a purpose." It was an order, not a request. Calla didn't respond, but she knew what he wasn't saying. This wasn't just about appearances, it was about control, about sending a message to his enemies that she was his. And yet, the more time she spent around him, the more she realized that he wasn't unaffected by her presence. It was in the way his fingers tensed ever so slightly when he placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the room. It was in the way his jaw clenched when another man's gaze lingered on her for too long. It was in the way his eyes darkened when she deliberately leaned in to whisper, "You like owning things, don't you?" Lachlan's fingers twitched against her waist. "I don't own you, Calla." His voice was even, but there was something underneath, something strained, something he didn't want her to see. She turned, meeting his gaze head-on. "Then what is this?" He didn't answer. Instead, the moment was interrupted when a familiar voice cut through the room. "Lachlan." Calla turned to see Victor Caldwell approaching, his expression one of polite amusement. Lachlan's posture stiffened, his grip on Calla's waist tightening ever so slightly. "Victor," he greeted coolly. Victor's gaze flickered to Calla, his smirk widening.
"And you must be the infamous wife."
Calla forced a smile. "I suppose that makes you the infamous enemy." Victor let out a soft chuckle, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "She's sharp, Lachlan. I like her." Lachlan's grip tightened again, possessive, warning. "She's not here for your entertainment." Victor's smirk didn't fade. "Pity." He raised his glass in a mock toast before strolling away, disappearing into the sea of guests. Calla exhaled slowly, sensing the tension radiating from Lachlan's frame. "You're wound too tight," she murmured, keeping her voice light. "You should enjoy your own party." His eyes flicked to hers, something unreadable lurking beneath. "You think I enjoy these things?" "No," she admitted. "But you pretend well." His gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he looked away, jaw tightening. And just like that, something shifted. Lachlan's grip on her waist softened, but he didn't remove his hand. Instead, he guided her onto the dance floor, ignoring her slight resistance. "We're dancing?" she asked, brow raised. "People are watching." Calla shouldn't have cared, but when his hand slid over hers, when his other pressed against the small of her back, she felt her breath hitch. Lachlan Darcy was a man who commanded space, but here, in this moment, he was impossibly close. The world around them blurred as he led her across the dance floor, their movements smooth, effortless. "You do this often," she murmured. He tilted his head. "What? Pretend to be someone you're not." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I don't pretend," he said. "I adapt." Calla searched his face, trying to find the cracks in his mask. And then, something unexpected happened. Lachlan's fingers brushed against her bare back, light, fleeting, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. Her body reacted before her mind did. She leaned in just a little closer, her breath ghosting against his cheek. His grip faltered for half a second, so brief she almost missed it. And then, before she could think better of it, she whispered, "You feel it too, don't you?" Lachlan went rigid. For a fraction of a moment, his guard slipped, his gaze darkening as his eyes flickered to her lips. The air between them grew heavy, charged. He was going to kiss her. She could see it, feel it, taste the anticipation on the air. But then, he pulled away. The moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Lachlan stepped back, his expression unreadable once more. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice lower than before. Calla lifted her chin, masking the sting of rejection with a smirk. "If you say so." But deep down, she knew the truth. So did he. Lachlan wanted her, and it was killing him. The mansion was always silent at night. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence Calla had learned to cherish in her old life, when the world would quiet just enough for her to hear her own thoughts. This silence was thick, heavy, expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And tonight, it would. She wasn't sure what had drawn her to Lachlan's office, but once she was inside, she knew she wouldn't leave empty-handed. The room was as imposing as the man himself, all dark wood and cold edges, shelves filled with books that probably hadn't been touched in years. But Calla wasn't interested in the books. She was looking for something real. Her fingers skimmed over the desk, pulling open drawers one by one. Lachlan was meticulous, everything in its place, except for the bottom drawer, where a stack of papers had been shoved carelessly aside. Something about it felt wrong. She reached inside, pulling out a thin, folded document, the edges creased from years of wear. Her breath caught as she recognized her parents' names. The paper trembled in her hands as she unfolded it, scanning the text. It was a contract, not unlike the one she had been forced into. But this wasn't about marriage. This was something else entirely. The words blurred together, but the message was clear. Her parents had a deal with Lachlan Darcy, and whatever it was, it had cost them everything. A voice behind her made her spin, heart hammering. "Rowan." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with an expression too careful to be casual. "You really shouldn't be in here," he said, but there was no real scolding in his tone. Calla swallowed. "You knew." Rowan sighed, stepping further into the room. "I know a lot of things." His gaze flicked to the paper in her hands. But I also know that if you're looking for the truth, you won't like what you find. She clenched her jaw. Then tell me, what was my family involved in? Rowan hesitated. That was enough to confirm her suspicions. This wasn't just a coincidence. Calla, he said carefully, if you uncover his past, be prepared for the consequences. A chill ran down her spine, but she was done being in the dark. Without another word, she pushed past Rowan and went to find Lachlan. She found him on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his silhouette carved against the night sky. For a moment, she hesitated. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a way that settled deep into his bones. But then she remembered the document burning a hole in her palm, and the anger surged back. You knew my parents. Lachlan stilled. The night air wrapped around them, tense and unmoving. He didn't turn to face her, but she saw the shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his grip on the glass, the way his shoulders stiffened. Calla stepped closer. How long were you planning to keep that from me? Still, he said nothing. She slammed the paper onto the railing beside him. Say something, Lachlan. Finally, he turned. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. This isn't a conversation you want to have. Her heart pounded. That's not your choice to make. Lachlan exhaled, his jaw clenching. Your parents made a deal, Calla. One that ended badly. That's all you need to know. That's all I need to know, she echoed, incredulous. They died, Lachlan, and somehow, you were part of their world. Silence. And then, the walls went up. She saw it. The way his expression shuddered. The way the tension in his body shifted from something restrained to something closed off. Lachlan Darcy was many things, but above all, he was a man who controlled what people knew about him, and he was choosing not to tell her the truth. Calla shook her head, stepping back. You said I had no idea what I'd been thrown into. Maybe you're right, but you're the one keeping me blind. Lachlan said nothing, did nothing, and that hurt more than any answer he could have given. With a bitter laugh, she turned to leave. You can lock me in this house, surround me with guards, pretend you're protecting me, but you can't keep me from finding out the truth. She had barely taken 2 steps before his voice cut through the air, low and edged with warning. Calla. She paused but didn't turn back. I didn't want you in this, he murmured. I tried to keep you out of it. Her stomach twisted, but when she spoke, her voice was cold. Then you shouldn't have married me. She left him standing on the balcony, whiskey in hand, but for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. Calla had power now, and she was going to use it. The message came in the form of a note, slipped under her door, folded neatly, waiting like a silent threat. Calla stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. The words were simple. Come alone, or the answers die with me. There was no signature, no clear indication of who had sent it. But Calla knew. Victor. Her blood turned cold. She should have ignored it, should have gone straight to Lachlan, or at least Rowan. But the weight of Lachlan's silence, his refusal to tell her anything about her parents, still lingered in her chest like a wound that wouldn't heal. If she wanted the truth, she would have to take it herself. So she went. The location was a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place people came to when they wanted to conduct business that would never be recorded. Calla stepped inside, every muscle in her body tight with unease. The restaurant was empty except for a single table near the back, where Victor Caldwell sat with a glass of wine in hand, his expression one of mild amusement. He gestured toward the seat across from him. Brave of you to come, he mused. Or reckless. I haven't decided yet. Calla didn't sit. You wanted to talk. Start talking. Victor tilted his head, his gaze trailing over her like she was a puzzle he had yet to solve. She hated it. You're very direct, he noted, a quality I can admire. But let's not pretend you hold the power in this conversation. Calla clenched her fists. You said you had answers. Victor smiled. I do. And I could give them to you, Calla. I could tell you exactly why Lachlan refuses to let you see the past. Why your parents were involved in things you can't begin to imagine. But knowledge comes with a price. She swallowed hard. What price? Victor leaned forward, voice dropping. Leave Lachlan. Calla blinked. Excuse me? Victor's smile widened, but there was nothing friendly in it. He's dangerous. You know that. He's not protecting you, Calla. He's using you, and if you stay, you'll end up like everyone else who has ever been close to him, destroyed. Calla wanted to dismiss him, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but doubt curled in her chest like smoke. Lachlan had lied to her, and Victor was offering her the truth. She hesitated just long enough. That was her mistake, because the moment her body shifted, the sound of a door slamming open sent her heart into her throat. The air changed. Lachlan, he moved like a storm, fast and lethal, the cold fury on his face making the entire room feel 10 degrees colder. The tension was instant. Victor didn't flinch, but his smirk sharpened as Lachlan closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You made a mistake," Lachlan murmured, his voice dangerously low. Victor arched a brow. "Did I?" Lachlan didn't answer. He was already moving, grabbing Victor by the collar and slamming him back against the wall so hard the table rattled. The restaurant staff didn't react. This had been inevitable. Victor let out a rough chuckle, his lips curling. "Still as predictable as ever, I see." Lachlan's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "You think you can touch what's mine?" Calla's breath caught. Victor's gaze flicked to her, amusement flickering in his expression. "See? You are a possession, after all." Lachlan pulled back slightly, only to slam Victor against the wall again, harder this time. Calla had never seen him like this. Not cold, not detached. Rage. Pure, simmering, barely contained rage. "Lachlan," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't move, didn't even blink. The storm in his eyes was wild, uncontrolled, and for a moment, Calla thought he wouldn't stop. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let go. Victor straightened, smoothing out his shirt as if he hadn't just been seconds away from getting his throat crushed. "You're going to regret this," he murmured. Lachlan exhaled slowly. Then, almost casually, he smiled. "That implies I've ever regretted anything," he said, before grabbing Calla's wrist and pulling her out of the restaurant without another word. The car ride back was silent. Calla sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her pulse still racing. Lachlan's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles pale in the dim light. "How did you know where I was?" she finally asked. His jaw flexed. "You think I wouldn't have you followed?" A mix of irritation and guilt burned in her chest. "I was just trying to get answers." Lachlan let out a sharp breath, his control fraying at the edges. "And you thought going straight to Victor Caldwell was the way to do it?" "I thought he'd actually tell me the truth," she shot back. Lachlan's grip tightened. "Victor doesn't offer truth, Calla. He offers manipulation wrapped in just enough honesty to make you believe him." She turned to him, her pulse still erratic. "Then tell me the truth, Lachlan." A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he didn't say a word. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, unspoken emotions. Lachlan had been willing to tear Victor apart for even daring to threaten her, but he still wouldn't tell her why. And that scared her more than anything. Calla couldn't breathe. The truth had been sitting in front of her the whole time, hidden beneath half-truths and the walls Lachlan had so carefully built around himself. He had known her parents, not as a vague business connection, not as distant names on a forgotten contract. He had known them personally, and yet, he had said nothing. The revelation burned through her like wildfire, leaving nothing but anger in its wake. She stormed through the mansion, her pulse hammering, her hands shaking with the weight of betrayal. When she found Lachlan in his office, he was standing by the window, his back to her, his posture tense, as if he already knew she was coming. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, the words sharp and unwavering. Lachlan didn't turn around. "Calla." "No," she snapped. No more deflections. No more cryptic warnings. No more half-truths. Silence. It infuriated her. She stalked forward, slamming the document onto his desk, the one she had found, the one that tied him to her parents. "You knew them." His fingers curled slightly at his sides. "You knew them," she repeated, her voice cracking. "And you didn't think I deserved to know?" Lachlan finally turned, his expression unreadable. "It wouldn't have changed anything." Calla laughed, bitter and sharp. "Wouldn't have changed anything? You don't think knowing the man I was forced to marry had ties to my family before they died would have changed something?" Lachlan's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Calla felt something inside her snap. "Then make it simple, Lachlan. Tell me what happened to them." He didn't. He stayed silent. That was all the answer she needed. She let out a slow, shaky breath, something inside her cracking apart. "You don't trust me," Lachlan exhaled, running a hand over his face, looking almost tired. "It's not about trust." Calla clenched her jaw. "Then what is it about?" Lachlan hesitated, and that was the moment she knew. He would never tell her. No matter how much she pushed, no matter how much she begged for the truth, he would always hold it just out of reach. Like she was something fragile, like she was something that couldn't handle the weight of it. Calla turned away, her heart pounding. "I can't do this," she muttered. Lachlan stiffened. "Calla," but she was already moving toward the door, her mind racing. She couldn't keep playing his game. She needed answers. And if Lachlan wouldn't give them to her, she'd find them herself, even if it meant going to Victor. The drive to Victor's estate was a blur. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to reconsider. But Calla wasn't the kind of person to walk away from the truth. Not anymore. Victor was expecting her. When she stepped into his office, he was already leaning against his desk, a smug smile playing at his lips. Well, he drawled. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Calla crossed her arms, keeping her expression cold. "Tell me about my parents." Victor's smile widened. So you finally realized Lachlan isn't the knight in shining armor he pretends to be." Calla hated the way he said it, hated that he had even an ounce of truth to his words. Victor gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit." She didn't move. "I'm not here to play games," she said. "Tell me what you know." Victor let out a slow breath, his amusement fading slightly. "Your parents weren't saints, Calla. They were involved in a world you don't understand. And so was Lachlan." Her stomach twisted. Victor's gaze darkened. He wasn't just some distant acquaintance. He was in the middle of it all. Calla's pulse pounded. "What does that mean?" Victor tilted his head. "It means your parents didn't just die, Calla. They were killed." The air left her lungs. Victor continued, his voice slow, deliberate. "And I'd bet everything I own that Lachlan knows exactly why." Calla felt like she was falling. Lachlan hadn't just known her parents. He had been part of whatever got them killed. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she took a shaky step back. Victor watched her closely. "You don't have to go back to him, you know? You could stay here. I could protect you." Calla snapped back to reality. She wasn't a fool. Victor wasn't offering protection. He was offering control. She had made a mistake coming here. "I need to go," she murmured, turning toward the door. Victor didn't stop her, but as she reached for the handle, his voice followed her. "When you're ready to stop lying to yourself, you know where to find me." Calla left without looking back. The drive back to the mansion was different. Before, she had been chasing answers. Now she had too many, and all of them led back to Lachlan. When she stepped through the doors of the estate, he was waiting for her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were full of something she couldn't name. Calla didn't stop walking. She didn't speak. She just brushed past him, heading straight for her room, locking the door behind her. And for the first time since this all began, Lachlan let her go. The weight of Victor's words clung to her skin long after she left his estate. They were killed. "And I'd bet everything I own that Lachlan knows exactly why." The idea had burrowed deep inside her, poisoning every memory, every conversation she'd had with Lachlan since their forced wedding. His evasions, his silence, the way he controlled every piece of information she had access to. It made sense, and it made her sick. By the time she reached the mansion, Calla felt numb. She stepped inside, her heart hammering, her thoughts colliding against each other. She had spent so much time trying to figure out who Lachlan really was. Now, she finally had her answer. She didn't go to him. She couldn't. Instead, she locked herself in her room, pacing like a caged animal, her emotions unraveling. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the wall, her mind a storm of anger and confusion. But when the knock came, sharp, controlled, demanding, she knew it was him. She hesitated before opening the door. Lachlan stood on the other side, his suit slightly disheveled, his expression cold, unreadable. But his eyes, they were dark with something far worse than anger. "Where were you?" His voice was low, but she could hear the strain beneath it. Calla lifted her chin. "Out." Something flickered in his gaze. He didn't speak immediately, but she could feel the shift in the air between them, the way it became heavier, sharper. You went to him, he finally said. It wasn't a question. Callah's pulse stuttered. Lachlan already knew. She should have expected that. Of course he knew. He took a slow step forward, his presence swallowing the space between them. Tell me I'm wrong, Callah. She swallowed, her throat dry. Tell me, he repeated, low and lethal, his patience fraying at the edges. Callah didn't answer, and that silence? It destroyed everything. Lachlan exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his fingers twitching at his sides, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to lash out or walk away. You went to Victor Caldwell, he said, almost to himself. His voice was rough, like the words physically hurt him. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I needed answers, Lachlan. And you? His expression snapped, cold fury breaking through. I was protecting you. Lachlan's voice was sharp enough to cut. His control, his legendary, ice-cold control, was cracking right in front of her. Callah flinched, but he wasn't done. You think I kept things from you to manipulate you? His laugh was humorless, edged with something dangerous. You think I wanted this? She opened her mouth, but he didn't let her speak. I kept you in the dark because the second Victor knew you were looking for answers, he'd sink his claws into you. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing uneven. And you? He ran a hand over his face, his voice dropping into something lower, almost hoarse. You handed yourself to the devil instead. The words hit her like a physical blow. Callah's stomach twisted. Lachlan turned away sharply, his hands on his hips, his head tilted toward the floor. His shoulders were tight with tension, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike or break. The silence between them stretched, suffocating. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, emptier. You don't trust me. Callah inhaled sharply. That's exactly what it is, he interrupted, finally turning back to her. You were so desperate for answers. You didn't stop to think about what kind of game Victor was playing. Callah's hands trembled. Had she made a mistake? Victor had been convincing, so damn convincing. But looking at Lachlan now, the hurt beneath the fury, the betrayal hidden behind his cold mask, she felt something sharp twist inside her. She had doubted him, and that doubt had broken something between them. Lachlan let out a slow exhale, as if he were forcing himself to calm down. When he spoke next, his voice was controlled again, but not in the way it usually was. This wasn't cold calculation. This was distance. You want the truth? He met her gaze, his expression guarded, unreadable. Fine. You'll have it. Callah's breath caught. But when you do, you won't be able to take it back. His voice was so final, so absolute, that it sent a chill down her spine. Before she could say anything, Lachlan turned and walked away. This time, he didn't stop. And for the first time since stepping into this world, Callah realized, maybe Victor wasn't the only one who had set a trap. Maybe she had built one herself, and she had just walked straight into it. Callah hadn't expected regret to feel like this. It wasn't just the weight in her chest or the ache in her bones. It was the cold realization that she had broken something that might never be whole again. And now, she was trapped. Victor's estate was more of a fortress than a home. She had agreed to come back for answers, but now she understood. He never intended to let her leave. Rowan was the one who got her out. He had shown up in the middle of the night, slipping past Victor's security like a ghost. You shouldn't have trusted him, he had muttered as he led her through the back corridors. Callah had barely managed to keep up with him as they maneuvered through the shadows. I didn't trust him, she admitted, her voice raw. I just didn't know who else to believe. Rowan shot her a look. And do you know now? She had swallowed, her throat tight. Yes, she did. She had made the wrong choice. And now she had to fix it. The mansion was dark when she arrived. Callah slipped through the entrance, her pulse hammering as she moved through the halls. She knew where to find him. Lachlan wasn't the type to disappear when things got hard. He faced things head-on, even when it hurt. And right now, Callah was the one who had to face him. She found him in his office, seated behind his desk, a single glass of whiskey resting beside him. He didn't look up when she entered. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier than usual. Callah's throat tightened. Lachlan, why are you here? His voice was cold, detached in a way she had never heard before. She stepped forward. I was wrong. That got his attention. His gaze lifted, dark and unreadable. About what? Calla clenched her fists. About you. About everything. Silence. Then, slowly, Lachlan set his glass down. You went to Victor, he said, his voice unnervingly calm. You believed him over me. Calla's breath stuttered. You handed yourself over to a man who would have destroyed you, he continued, rising to his feet. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His quiet rage was louder than any shouted words could be. Calla's hands trembled. I made a mistake. Lachlan let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. You didn't just make a mistake, Calla. You shattered every ounce of trust one had in you. His words cut deep. She took a shaky breath. Then let me fix it. Lachlan scoffed, turning away. You can't. Calla moved before she could stop herself, grabbing his wrist. Lachlan, please. He went still. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned back to face her. She saw it then. The thing he had been hiding behind all that fury. Pain. Raw, unfiltered pain. You asked me why I married you, Lachlan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Calla's pulse hammered. I thought I didn't need you, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. A sharp breath, a flicker of vulnerability. I was wrong. The words broke something inside her. Calla didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She moved. And this time, he didn't pull away. Her lips crashed into his, desperation and longing tangling together, the taste of whiskey and anger and regret lingering between them. Lachlan's hands found her waist, his grip possessive, as if he had been waiting for this just as much as she had. The kiss wasn't soft. It was bruising, raw, full of the words they hadn't spoken, full of the trust they had broken and the things they weren't ready to admit. By the time they pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Calla searched his face. Lachlan exhaled slowly. You can't leave again. She nodded, her chest tightening. I won't. It wasn't just a promise. It was a decision. One she had made long before she even realized it. The night was too quiet. Calla felt it before she saw it. The shift in the air, the tension wrapping around her like a vice. She had learned to recognize danger, had spent enough time in Lachlan's world to know when something was coming for her. But knowing didn't mean she was prepared. The moment she stepped out of her room, it happened. A rough hand clamped over her mouth. Cold steel pressed against her ribs. Calla struggled, thrashing, but they were prepared. A sharp pinch at her neck, a needle, a sedative. Her vision blurred. The last thing she heard was Victor Caldwell's voice, smooth as silk and sharp as a blade. Didn't I tell you, Calla? You should have stayed with me. And then, darkness. Lachlan felt the shift the second he stepped into the mansion. It was too quiet. His gut twisted as he strode toward Calla's room, a cold sense of dread creeping up his spine. The door was open, his breath stilled. The guards were gone. Calla was gone. And on her bed, a single message was left behind. A playing card, face up, the King of Spades. Victor. Lachlan inhaled slowly, his control razor-thin. He had warned Calla. He had told her this world would never let her go. And now? Now, Victor had made his final mistake. Lachlan was going to end this. When Calla came to, the world wasn't steady. She blinked against the dim light, her head heavy, her arms tied to a chair. A basement. No, a warehouse. Cold concrete beneath her bare feet. The sharp scent of gasoline and damp metal in the air. A figure stood in front of her. Victor. Calla clenched her jaw. You really have a thing for dramatic entrances. Victor smirked. And you have a thing for making poor decisions. She refused to be afraid. She would not let him see fear. What do you want? She demanded. Victor tilted his head. Leverage, my dear. You were always the key to breaking Lachlan. And now, his smirk widened. I have you. Calla let out a slow breath. She had been waiting for this moment, because she wasn't weak anymore. The second Victor stepped closer, Calla moved. She twisted her wrist, slipping free of the loosened rope she had been working on for the last 5 minutes. Then she struck. Her knee slammed into Victor's ribs, sending him stumbling back. The guards moved toward her, but she was already running. The door burst open before she could even reach it. And there he was. Lachlan. His eyes were dark, wild, murderous. And Calla had never felt safer. A gun was in his hand. His suit was wrinkled, dusted with blood. as if he had already fought his way through half of Victor's men. Victor sighed, straightening. I was hoping you'd come. Lachlan raised his gun, his expression lethal. I came to finish this. Victor's men lunged. Gunfire exploded. Calla ducked, her heart pounding as chaos erupted around her. Lachlan moved like a predator, every shot precise, every movement calculated. He fought his way through Victor's men with brutal efficiency, his fury a cold, unrelenting force. Calla refused to be a bystander. She grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung, knocking one of Victor's guards unconscious. Lachlan saw. For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Pride. Then, Victor moved. A blade glinted in the dim light as Victor lunged at Calla. Lachlan's body reacted before his mind did. A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Victor staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. His knife clattered to the ground. Lachlan exhaled, his gun still raised. His hands didn't shake. Victor stumbled back, his smirk faltering. You. His legs buckled. And then, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Calla's chest heaved. She turned to Lachlan, her pulse racing, her hands still shaking from the fight. His eyes met hers. For a moment, they just stared. Then, Lachlan crossed the space between them. Before she could say anything, his hands were on her face, his forehead pressing against hers, his breath ragged. Don't ever do that again, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Calla swallowed hard. I had to. Lachlan's fingers curled around her waist, pulling her closer. I can't lose you. Calla closed her eyes. She had spent so much time fighting him, doubting him, running from him. But right now, all she wanted was him. So she didn't pull away. And neither did he. The sirens blurred in Calla's ears, the flashing lights of the ambulance a haze against the darkness. Lachlan's blood stained her hands. She pressed them against his wound, desperate, her own heartbeat erratic as they sped toward the hospital. Stay with me, she whispered, voice shaking. You don't get to die, Lachlan. Not after everything. His breathing was shallow. His skin was too pale. For the first time since she met him, Lachlan Darcy looked breakable. And that terrified her. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sterile emptiness. Calla sat in the waiting room, her hands still stained red, her mind numb. Rowan arrived at some point, but she barely registered his presence. He said something, a reassurance, a promise that Lachlan was strong, but none of it mattered, not until the doctor appeared. He's stable, the man said, adjusting his glasses. We removed the bullet. He's lucky. Any closer to the artery, and he wouldn't have made it. Calla felt the floor tilt beneath her. She swallowed, forcing herself to ask, Can I see him? The doctor hesitated. He's still unconscious, but yes. She didn't wait for more. She needed to see him. The room was too cold, too quiet. Lachlan lay in the hospital bed, monitors beeping softly around him, his skin ashen against the stark white sheets. The sight made something inside her chest splinter. Calla moved toward him slowly, as if afraid he'd disappear if she got too close. She had seen him fight, had seen him unbreakable, untouchable. But here, he was just a man, and she wasn't ready to lose him. Her fingers brushed against his, and a breath shuddered through her lips. She laced her fingers with his, gripping tightly, anchoring herself. You're an idiot, she murmured, voice raw. A stubborn, reckless, impossible idiot. The monitors beeped. The room stayed still. Calla exhaled shakily, closing her eyes. If you die, I will never forgive you. The words trembled with everything she had been too afraid to say before. Because the truth was clear now. She loved him, and she wasn't going anywhere. The first thing Lachlan felt was warmth. His body was heavy, sore, but there was something grounding him. A hand, small and warm, wrapped around his own. His fingers twitched. A soft gasp. Then, Lachlan? His eyelids dragged open, the world unfocused before settling on her. Calla. She was right there, her eyes wide, red-rimmed, her lips parted like she had been holding her breath. Relief crashed over him. You're still here, he rasped, his throat dry. Calla let out a breathless laugh, somewhere between exasperation and something softer. Where else would I be? Lachlan swallowed, his body protesting when he tried to move. He was alive. But more than that, she hadn't left. His gaze locked onto hers, searching. Something in her had changed. Something he couldn't place, until she spoke again. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "And I realized, I don't want a world without you in it." His chest tightened. "Calla." She shook her head, her fingers tightening around his. "I love you, Lachlan." His heart stopped, restarted, thundered. His breath caught, his body aching for reasons that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. She loved him. He had never, not once in his life, thought he'd hear those words spoken to him. Not from her. Not like this. Lachlan forced his body to move, lifting his hand to cup her cheek, brushing away a stray tear. "You love me?" he repeated, his voice hoarse, like he needed to say it out loud to believe it. Calla let out a shaky laugh, leaning into his touch. "Yeah," she whispered. "I do." A slow, aching smile pulled at his lips. "Then don't ever leave me again," Calla breathed out, her own smile breaking through the tears. "Never." The days blurred together in the quiet hum of hospital monitors and whispered conversations. Lachlan was healing, physically, at least. The bullet wound had been clean, the doctors assured them. A few weeks of rest, some physical therapy, and he'd be back to himself. But the real wounds, the ones that weren't visible, those would take longer. Calla stayed with him. She didn't leave, not once. At first, he had tried to push her away, telling her to go home, to sleep in an actual bed instead of the uncomfortable chair by his bedside. But Calla had simply crossed her arms, given him that stubborn look that always drove him insane, and said, "Shut up, Lachlan." And that had been that. She was there for every checkup, every restless night. She was there when he woke up gasping for memories that weren't dreams, her fingers always finding his, grounding him. She was there. And for the first time in his life, Lachlan let someone stay. Rowan showed up on the third day. Calla had stepped out to get coffee, leaving Lachlan alone when the door swung open. Rowan leaned against the frame, arms crossed, studying him. "You look like hell," he said. Lachlan huffed a quiet laugh. "Feel like it too." A beat of silence. Then Rowan exhaled. "I should have seen it coming," he admitted. "Victor going after her, using her to get to you." Lachlan held his gaze. "Not your fault." Rowan shook his head. "Maybe not, but I should have done more." He hesitated, shifting slightly. "I need you to know, I was never working with him. I'd never betray you like that." Lachlan already knew, but hearing Rowan say it, seeing the regret in his eyes, the weight in his voice, it mattered. "Yeah," Lachlan murmured. "I know." Rowan let out a slow breath, nodding. "Good." He pushed off the doorway, turning to leave, but paused. "You scared her, you know," he said, glancing back. "Calla. She didn't sleep until she knew you were going to make it." Lachlan's chest tightened. "She loves you," Rowan added, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Still trying to figure out why, though. Lachlan rolled his eyes, but a faint smile lingered as Rowan walked away. Calla stood on the mansion balcony, the city stretched out beneath her like a sea of lights. It had been weeks since Victor was gone, but there were still nights where she woke up expecting something to go wrong, where she expected to feel trapped again. But she wasn't. She was here. She was free. And somehow, after everything, she had found something she never thought she would. A home. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, pulling her against a familiar warmth. "Lachlan." She smiled as he pressed a soft kiss against her shoulder. "You're supposed to be resting," she murmured. "I'm fine." She turned, archiving a brow. "You were literally shot, Lachlan." He smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm a fast healer." Calla rolled her eyes, but let him pull her closer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "I thought I lost you." Lachlan's arms tightened around her. "You're not losing me, Calla." She looked up at him, searching his gaze. "Promise." Lachlan leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "Promise." Calla had spent her whole life dreaming of freedom. The kind that came without strings, without expectations, without cages, golden or otherwise. And now, it was being handed to her. Lachlan stood in his office, a single sheet of paper resting between his fingertips. His expression was unreadable, His storm-gray eyes locked onto hers with something she couldn't quite name. She swallowed. She knew what this was. The contract. The one that had bound her to him. The one that had forced her into this life, this marriage, this war. And now? Now, he was tearing it apart. The sound of paper ripping was louder than it should have been in the still room. Calla exhaled shakily, watching as Lachlan let the pieces fall from his hands, scattering across the polished wood floor. The weight of it should have lifted. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You're free," Lachlan said, his voice steady, but his grip on the desk was tight enough to make his knuckles pale. Calla's heart pounded. "You don't have to stay," he continued, not looking at her now. "You don't owe me anything. No more contracts. No more debts. You can leave, Calla." She didn't move, didn't breathe, because he meant it. For the first time since this all began, Lachlan wasn't trying to control her. He wasn't forcing her hand. He was giving her a choice. Calla forced herself to speak, but her voice came out quieter than she intended. "And what if I want to stay?" That made him look at her. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his expression, something raw, something unguarded. Then it was gone. This wasn't real, he reminded her, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. "You don't have to pretend anymore." Calla stepped closer. "You think this was pretend?" she whispered. Lachlan held her gaze, but his walls were back up, fortress high, unshakable. "You never wanted this," he said quietly. Calla let out a small, breathless laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was tragic how little he understood. "I didn't want to be forced into a marriage." "No," she admitted. "But you? You were never the thing I wanted to run from, Lachlan." He stiffened. "I ran because I was scared," she continued, "because I didn't understand what this meant. What you meant." Her voice wavered slightly, but she didn't stop. "But now? I know." Lachlan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Calla, I love you," she interrupted, stepping closer. "I love you, and you're telling me to leave." His jaw clenched. "Because you should. But I don't want to." She reached for him then, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, forcing him to see her, really see her. "I want to stay," she whispered. "But not because of a contract. Not because I have to." She lifted her chin, her next words steady. "Sure. I want to stay because I choose you." The breath he took was sharp, almost like he didn't believe her, like he couldn't. But Calla didn't waver. She waited, heart pounding, hands trembling against him. And then, Lachlan broke. His lips crashed into hers, desperate, claiming, like she was the only thing tethering him to this world. Calla melted into him, into the warmth, into the way his hands gripped her like he was afraid she'd disappear. She kissed him not to prove a point, but because she needed to, because she had made her choice. And that choice was him. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, their breathing unsteady. Lachlan's hands still held her like he couldn't bear to let go. His voice was raw when he whispered, "I don't know how to be what you need." Calla smiled softly, brushing her fingers against his jaw. "You already are." His chest rose and fell, his walls finally crumbling. Calla exhaled, pressing one last, gentle kiss to his lips before whispering, "You were never my prison, Lachlan." Her fingers laced with his. "You were my escape."